Shalom, brothers and sisters, giving honor and praise to the Most High, the Creator and the Maker of heaven and earth. My name is Yeshaya Yisrael of the tribe of Dan of the nation of Israel. This particular teaching is a recap, you may say, in regards to what went down and what transpired between Black people throughout the world. Now, this particular teaching is not centered on one particular nation or one particular group of Black people, because we have to remember that as Africa was never monolithic, neither are all Black people monolithic, that there's different groups of Black people throughout the world. And so this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. Okay, so let us go on, brothers and sisters, in this particular aspect. Let us continue in the same vein. This right here that you see is called by the title Black Arabs, Black Indians. All right. So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. What you're looking at here, where the arrow is on the left hand side, is a picture of a black man that's truly an Arab. All right. According to Gert Muller in his book, The Roman Doctor Gallo stated that the Arabs that they met during the era of the Roman times were black people or swarthy. All right. So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. What you're looking at here, brothers and sisters, where the arrow is on the right hand side, is black Indians, referred to in history as Dravidians. All right. That's East India. All right. So the original Arabs and original Indians by East India were people that you will consider and call black of today. Let us go on to the next slide. Black Egyptian, Black Hebrew. What you're looking at on the left-hand side is a picture of Nefertari of Dynasty 18 of Egypt. All right. And what you're looking at on the right-hand side is a picture from the Duras Europas, all right, in which the Israelites in the land of Syria made pictures of the Exodus according to the way they understood it. This has been pointed out on other slides or other presentations, but I just want this to be shown yet again, brothers and sisters, for edification purposes. Okay? Let us go on, if you will, to the next slide. Black Asiatics in Egypt. Now, what you're looking at right here, brothers and sisters, is a picture where the arrow is dated to the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, of an Asiatic man within the land of Egypt. Now, not for nothing, one of the things we wanted to point out is that the Egyptians, if you look at their own pictures, they were not pictured in most cases with what can be considered some kind of full length of a beard. All right. The Egyptians were, in most cases, what you call clean cut, quote unquote. All right. So every black picture that you see in Egypt is not always an Egyptian. All right. So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. All right. What you're looking at, brothers and sisters, on the right hand side is a picture of an Asiatic person that was the captive in the land of Egypt. Now you can even tell by the native Egyptian dress way and the picture that you see right here that there is a distinction between the two. All right. So this is stuff we want to point out for reference purposes. All right. Note yet the beard yet again as shown. All right. Next slide. Black Ethiopians, Black Babylonians. What you're looking at on the left-hand side, brothers and sisters, is a picture of what is understood as a modern man or a person in modern day Ethiopia. All right. You may want to pay not to be disrespectful to the coarse hair, you know, what some may consider quote unquote nappy, if you will, which is not uncommon for people of color. Okay. Now, the reason why I put this picture here and shown it on the right hand side is to show that the ancient Babylonians, now, this book right here speaks about Nebuchadnezzar, You know, Nebuchadnezzar, the one who conquered Jerusalem. All right. The Babylonian Empire was started by Hamites, if we use the aspect of the biblical terminology. All right. So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. Now, one of the codes of Babylon in law code dated to the era of, we're talking what, 13th, maybe the 12th, or before that century BCE, and what they call the Code of Hammurabi. All right. The Code of Hammurabi, brothers and sisters, Hammurabi. Ham means, in the biblical terminology, Ham. Hammurabi means Ham the Great. All right. So the ancient Babylonians, in most cases, were deemed in biblical terminologies as the aspect of Babylonians or Hamites. All right. Another thing to point out is that the kingdom of Babylon was not only strictly Hamitic, you also had the Shemite people from the people of Aprakshad, which were the Chaldeans. All right. So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. All right. Next slide. The Hyksos aspects. Canaan. What you're looking at right here, brothers and sisters, on the left-hand side is a picture, brothers and sisters, of the ancient Hyksos as they were deemed. They didn't call themselves that. You understand? That were going into the land of Egypt. And this is dated to the era of Kemunhotep's tomb and the era of Dynasty 12 of Egypt. So this is something, brothers and sisters, we want to point out for edification purposes. All right? What you're looking at right here, brothers and sisters, is a picture of an ancient Canaanite, all right, found in the land of what we call Palestine, or in ancient terminology, Israel. All right. So if we want to pay close attention, if we will, to what we consider and know and understand as black features, such as the lips, the broad nose, slanted eyes, and so forth and so on. This would have been the kind of person or people that Joshua, the son of Nun, would have met and ran into. All right. So now when you go in the scriptures in the book of Joshua and what happened between the Canaanites and the Israelites, you don't see none of the racist tractates as you see with the European Jews in their Talmud, such as saying Ham got big lips because he lied, and so forth and so on. The Holy Scriptures, the Old Testament, doesn't condone those kind of racial epithets. All right. So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. All right. Let's go on, if you will, brothers and sisters, to the next slide. Hyksos aspect part 2. All right. Now, the Hyksos we spoke about before, but we also want to speak about it again in this particular aspect. Here is more so the original depiction of them, and here is the more so refined picture of them. Now, this is not to play the Willie Lynch game of the dark skin and the light skin, because there were light skinned people back then. There were dark skinned people back then. There's nothing new under the sun. All right. So we want to point that out for edification purposes. But even if we look at the aspect of them supposedly have been bleached, in most cases they were, as far as the paintings were concerned, later on by Egyptologists. You will notice, brothers and sisters, that if they wanted to make them quote unquote lighter or quote unquote white, they forgot to change the hairstyle of the young one right here. So even if they wanted to do that, this person here, pay close attention to the hairstyle, because the coarse or quote unquote nappy hair or rough hair texture belongs to a particular group of people today referred to in most cases as colored. So let's go back up for a reason for edification purposes. You see this man's hair right here that we want to point out, not too far different from the kind of hair texture that I personally have. This right here you see there. What is the difference between what we just shown there and the hair texture right here? Shown also right here where the arrow is. So this is something we want to point out. The people who were called Hyksos were not Europeans. The Hyksos were not Greeks. All right. That has been an unfortunate teaching that has surfaced. All right. Trying to sit there and take ancient Egypt as the catalyst of all black, and anything against Egypt would have been all white. No, brothers and sisters. That right there is what you call pseudo scholarship. All right. So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. What you're looking at right here is what they refer to as like a dashiki. All right. Now, of course, there are certain emblems and symbols that represented certain kinds of things and so forth and so on. But we want to point this out for a purpose, brothers and sisters. If you look at this particular style right here, which is deemed in most cases some kind of African garb, What is the difference in this colorful kind of texture and garment that is, and the garments that you see here and here? Here we see it as blue, and here we see blue. Here we see orange or some kind of red. Here we see orange. All right. And here we see some kind of orange or red. What, brothers and sisters, is the distinction between the images of the Hyksos, all right, or the Amu or the Asiatics that was in and shown in the tomb of Kemunhotep and what is referred to as the dashiki of today? There's no difference when you go right down to it. Just like there's no difference in the hair texture between the Hyksos that was shown in the modern Ethiopian man. What am I pointing out, brothers and sisters, as this teaching gets into, is blacks throughout the world. This is something we want to show for edification purposes. All right, next slide. Black Persians, black Minoans, all right, from Persia / Iran. The ancient Persian Empire was in Iran, all right? So this is something we want to sit there and show in this particular regard. This is dated, brothers and sisters, to the 5th century BCE. And you can see how swarthy or dark these images are of the ancient Persians, all right? So this is in Iran. These were the ancient Iranian people, or the people of Elam in the Bible, all right? Now, what you're looking at right here, brothers and sisters, is a picture of the black Minoans, all right? This goes to show you that these people were in Europe, dated to the time of the era before what you call the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War, brothers and sisters, was in the 5th century BCE, and that was in between the aspect of what happened between Sparta and their enemies, all right? So you may want to research that, because that is when they try to sit there between Sparta and Athens, when they try to sit there and change the images of the ancient people in the Greek islands from one color to the next. So this is something we want to emphasize in this particular regard. Let's go on to the next slide. Etruscans, and then we see Sumer, Iraq. Etruscans, brothers and sisters, as you see right here, is how they're being depicted or being depicted in pictures. These people, brothers and sisters, are the original people called the Italians. What are we pointing out, brothers and sisters, is that the ancient people in ancient Europe were, in most cases, people of color. Black people were all over the earth. And this is why when we get into the presentation later that has been presented against the teaching or the reality of the Atlantic slave trade doesn't make any kind of sense. Because you can't say black people were already here in North America already, so therefore no slavery happened. That doesn't make any sense. And we're going to show that as we go along in this particular aspect. Because as you can see right here, we show black Hebrews, black Egyptians, black Ethiopians, black Asiatics, and here we can show you on the left-hand side of the screen here, black Europeans. All right, so this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. And here we see Sumer, Iraq. This would have been an ancient person called an Iraqi. And you can see what this image is in that particular regard. The ancient world, brothers and sisters, was not a White House. Next slide. Okay, let's go in now. You have Egypt, Kush, and Nubia. All right, the kingdom of Kush, 700 BC. During this era of 700 BC was during the era when the northern kingdom of Israel already fell to the Assyrians, and you had the southern kingdom of Judah still being the kingdom. All right, this is during the era of what you call Taharqa, which gets you into the aspect, brothers and sisters, when we're getting into this particular part right here in Dynasty 25 of ancient Egypt. So what are we dealing with? You had the 6th cataract, the 4th cataract, as well as the 5th, the 3rd, the 2nd, and it goes all the way up right here, and then it dumps into the Mediterranean Sea. We're pointing out, brothers and sisters, that the ancient people of Kush, the ancient Kushite Empire, extended all the way up to where the children of Israel was over in this particular aspect. In the book that I wrote, Deuteronomy 28, 15 to 68, The Condition of the Blacks, a book that you can get online by that name, I attempted to make the salient point, brothers and sisters, that the angel that you see of in the book of 2 Kings that fought off the Assyrians was actually the army of the ancient Ethiopians. Because in Hebrew thought, the word for angel is mal'ak. Mal'ak means messenger. So a person can be such that. So we don't want to always try to think about the aspect presented, no offense intended, by solely the Catholic Church, that every messenger or slash angel came out of the heavens with wings and so forth and so on. Yes, in the Hebrew thought, you had the aspect of the cherubim and the seraphim that you read of in Isaiah chapter 6 in the Bible. However, we also know that a malach, translated as angel or messenger, can also be a human being. So this is something we wanted to point out for edification purposes. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Upper and Lower Egypt. All right, what you're looking at right here, brothers and sisters, what you're looking at right here, brothers and sisters, in this particular regard, Upper Egypt, as we've been pointing out in the past, all right, is south. Lower Egypt, as we see right here, is north. All right. So what we're pointing out, brothers and sisters, all right, is that Upper Egypt is the southern part of Egypt that you see as back of Nubia here, all right, leading you all the way south to where you get to Ethiopia. And Lower Egypt is the northern part of Egypt, which leads you off into where the Mediterranean Sea is. All right. So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. All right. Let's go on, if we will, to the next slide. The Dahi, Setu, and the Sea Peoples. What you're looking at right here, brothers and sisters, the Jahi, Setu, Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples, brothers and sisters, I spoke of in my book called Egypt Talking Writing. All right, did the Torah come from the culture of Tameri? You can actually get that particular book online as well. Now, what do we want to point out about the Sea Peoples in the aspect of the Jahi and Setu, which were Egyptian terms in regards to the Asiatics? The Sea Peoples extended all the way from being Canaanites in modern day Palestine all the way to the Libyans, which is on the west side of Egypt. All right. So if you look at this carefully, you begin to see that they were different shades, from very dark to light. Yet they didn't have in their own understanding and thinking the aspect and thinking of the terminologies that we see today of disrespect and separating the dark and the light. The nations of the ancient world didn't see themselves separated based on a light skin or dark skin aspect. They saw themselves as different based upon language, based upon culture, and based upon geography. So this is something we want to point out in that particular regard. Now, when you look at this picture right here, this is the same picture as you see right here where the arrow is. And Philistine. The people of the Philistines come from Kaftor, which is also in history known as Crete. So when you go in the Bible and it says, did the Most High not deliver the people of Philistia also from the land of Kaftor? When you go into the book of Amos, you begin to see what that's talking about. All right. So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. The Philistines was on the west side of where the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Dan was. All right. And as we can see, this is how the Philistines in depiction actually looked. And that's stated. The ancient tribe of Judah did not come with, like the European Jew comes with the aspect of racist tactics, such as saying somebody has a wide nose because of this, or somebody became black or dark because of such and such. So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. All right, let's go on, if we will, brothers and sisters, to the next slide. Merneptah stele. All right, this is the aspect of the translation from the Merneptah stele, as we've spoken of in other presentations. But I put this in this particular one for a reason. It says in part, the princes are prostrate, saying mercy. Desolation is Tehenu. Hati is that pacified. Plundered is the Canaan. Carried off is Ashkelon. Israel is laid waste. His seed is not. So now, brothers and sisters, I already presented in other aspects that the Merneptah stele is actually the stele of Amenhotep III that Merneptah put his name upon. Now, if that is the case, we can jump the gun if you want to and say that is the case. that would mean that the ancient Israelites were spoken of by the ancient Egyptians and the aspect of dynasty 18 of Egypt. Why does that become important, brothers and sisters? Is because Amenhotep, brothers and sisters, was before the aspect of Akhenaten, which means that when you find Europeans not even citing any Hebrew or Egyptian record, but when you find Europeans saying that the ancient Hebrew culture taught to the Israelites by their prophet Moses was essentially a plagiarism from the culture of Akhenaten, such cannot be the case. Because in order for Israel to have been noted inside of Dynasty 18 of Egypt, taking the understanding and fact that Merneptah stele is actually the stele of Amenhotep, which later on Merneptah had his name placed upon it. This is why Egyptian chronology is difficult to sit there and go step by step by step by step, because the ancient Egyptians put their names on other people's monuments. So this is something we want to point out in that particular regard. So now, taking that to be the case, taking that to be a fact, brothers and sisters, it leads to be known that the European is incorrect when he says that the Israelite prophet and leader Moses was taught by the priests of Akhenaten to make the Torah that we see today, because Israel was known inside of the aspect of Akhenaten's father. Also, we want to point out that the culture of Israel and the culture of the Egyptians is different. So this is something we want to point out in that particular regard. Now, when brothers who were Kemetic actually at one time, all right, attempted to try to debate the Israelites, one of the questions that they asked is, where do you see Canaan on the map? Brothers and sisters, Canaan is written about inside of the Egyptian records in more than one case. This is why it's important, as my teachers, relatives have told me, if you're going to be a moreh or teacher, study, 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 and then after that, study some more. And also, it is important to surround yourself with people that's of like minds. You want to surround yourself with people if you are a studier, if you are considered a moreh or a teacher. You want to be around other morim or teachers, because the fire can keep the fire hot. All right. So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. All right. So let's go on to the next slide. Zenu, Libyan. All right. Fragment from the mortuary temple of Ramses II depicting a Libyan. Brothers and sisters, Libyan people look like this. This is not European, even in image. This resembles, correct me if I'm wrong, the way I see it, the way they have the Olmec looking in Mexico. It to me doesn't look but so different between this image here that we see of the Libyan and the aspect of the Olmec that Ivan Sertima spoke about. Maybe I'm jumping the gun, but that's what I see it as in resemblance. Then we see right here, brothers and sisters, modern Berbers, ancient Libyans known as Libu, Meshwesh, and later as Moors. All right, we want to point out that the people who were called Moors didn't call themselves Moors. But let's get into this particular one right here. You can see how these people look, brothers and sisters. This is not to play the color game, but this is just something to point out. All right, ancient Libyans. These are the people called Tehenu or Tejenu, inside of what is said in many cases that the Merneptah stele, which I present, is actually the stele of Amenhotep. So the people who were within still the continent of Africa saw each other, and they may have had war, they may have had peace at different times. But we just want to show that there were different aspects of Black people, as many say melanated people, throughout different parts of the world. Let's go on to the next slide. Israelites. Now, why did I sit there and depict this one right here as shown inside of a book about ancient Ethiopia depicting the tribe of Judah? I did that deliberately, so we can sit there and get rid of the aspect of the games of dark and light. And believe it or not, within the so-called constituent community, you still see aspects of arguments between dark and light. I remember, and I say this in no disrespect, I told a brother who happens to be light-skinned, he asked me, do I think that the Hyksos of ancient Egypt were white? I said, no, brother. The ancient Hyksos look like you, the same complexion as my mother. And anybody who knows me, Moreh Yeshaya, also known as Kashub the Danite, I'm what you call a brown-skinned man. My mother was light-skinned. And the brother who asked me, do I think the Hyksos, who were pictured the same skin tone in certain cases as the man you see there on the left-hand side, do I think they were white? Nah, brother, they look like you. Conversation over. We have to, brothers and sisters, get rid of the Willie Lynch among our people. How are you said to be conscious and you still on the dark skin, light skin game? We have to sit there and annihilate that. All right. Now let's look at this right here. Here we see the depiction of the Israelites as going into captivity by the ancient Assyrians. Next slide. Oh, just so you know, this depiction that you see right here is from the walls inside of Ethiopia depicting Solomon. You know Solomon, the son of David. There's another depiction of Solomon as shown before, brothers and sisters, kind of a little more brown, and the aspect of his hair looking like they were cornrows going back. I've shown that picture in the past. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Egypt and Byblos. Under the kings of the 12th dynasty, Egypt once more became a highly organized, well-administered country with prosecuted policies in respect to Nubia, Libya, and Western Asia. There were co-regencies. What is the point in citing this particular part right here, brothers and sisters, is this, all right? Look at this here. This is Egypt, or Kemet, or the aspect of Sematawid. Sematawid meaning the unity of the two lands being southern Egypt and northern Egypt. Why do I mention the aspect of Byblos going back and forth? Because when you read the Imperial Papyrus, which dates to the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, you get to the aspect of them mentioning Byblos, which is referred to in certain cases as Gebal or Gebul. All right, so this is something we want to point out for edification purposes, brothers and sisters. The ancient nations, such as you see that we depicted and shown earlier here. All right, I want to go back to the slide over here. Hyksos aspect and Canaan. This is how the aspect of the ancient Canaanites would have looked in history. All right, as you see there where the arrow is. So let's go on, if we will, back to here. Remember, this record from ancient Egypt speaks of Canaan. Then we can go right here and we see where the ancient land of Canaan was. Sorry about that part. Right here, for those who are watching, that's how the people would have looked, with broad nose, slanting eyes, and protruding lips, like the way the Zenon papyrus of ancient Greece depicted the Israelites in Ptolemaic Egypt, as we pointed out in teaching on this particular channel. So this is something, brothers and sisters, when we say, why do we go in and teach as much as possible, is because we want to sit there and bring this light out to our people about our people. There was a video, pardon me, not a video. There was a game years ago, and it's still around, maybe online, right? And my mother, may she rest in peace, she bought it for me. And the name of that game was called In Search of Identity. I mentioned it inside of my book, Deuteronomy 28, right? In that particular game, In Search of Identity, it talked about Matthew Henson. It talked about Rosa Parks. It talked about Nefertiti. It talked about different people, even Shaka Zulu. But one of the things being raised as a member of the Israelites that I noticed that didn't depict were the ancient Israelites. So this is when I wanted to study personally deeper into the aspect of where do the Israelites fit in history. Because the Israelites, according to the story of the Israelites as related in the Bible, at one time was in Egypt, then went into the Sinai Peninsula, migrated over to Saudi Arabia, where they stayed with people of Midian, and then eventually came over through here, crossed the Jordan, through here. You had the tribes on the east side, you had Reuben, you had Gad and Manasseh, and then 9.5 tribes on this side, being from Judah, Simeon, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, and so forth. So I wanted to sit there and see where do those particular people fit in the world. And the evidence that I found was overwhelming. So this is no disrespect intended to the makers of the board game called assertive identity, because that can be, and I have no problem using the terminology, a crutch to sit there and get onto something else. There's nothing wrong with that. You understand? Now, let's look at this right here. Under the kings of the 12th dynasty, as we went over in the teaching that was done not too long ago, the 12th dynasty, brothers and sisters, is part of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. All right, as we pointed out in edification purposes in the past. All right, let's look at it. It says, under the kings of the 12th dynasty, Egypt once more became a highly organized, well administered country with prosecuted policies in respect to Nubia, which is down here where the arrow is, all right? Libya, which is west of Egypt, not shown on the map, and Western Asia. So if you can see the Epira Papyrus essentially dated to the era of Dynasty 13, which is also part of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, we can see why he mentioned Egypt as well as the land of Byblos, because Byblos is part of Western Asia. This is why we go line upon line, even within history, as the house of Israel. Next slide. The Hyksos matter. The term Hyksos is a Greek term meaning shepherd kings, but in the Egyptian, it is Heka or Hakushosret, meaning rulers of foreign lands. Some say rulers of mountainous lands. The Egyptians did not distinguish which particular nation these Asiatics belonged to. They simply called them a generic term. The other terms used are Amu, Set-Yu, and Retenu, as well as Jahi, as we spoke of in the past. So this is something we just want to sit there and talk about for edification purposes. You may want to look up these terminologies on your own time to fact check what a brother is presenting on his particular channel. Next slide. Asiatic man in Egypt. All right. So if you notice, brothers and sisters, you will not, correct me if I'm wrong, see a bearded man as a native to the true Egyptian people. The people who were noted for walking with beards were the Asiatic people. As a matter of fact, the priest of the ancient Israelites was told not to shave off the corners of his beard. And even when you find Israelites talking about beards, all Israelite males know who's able to grow one that you're supposed to have one. So what do we see in today's terminology of today when they say you should be quote unquote clean shaven? That is as disrespect to the man as telling a sister, telling a black woman that her hair needs a relaxer. Her hair is not upset. She's not upset. You're upset at the way she looks in her natural state. So when it says, or when people say that a sister should get a relaxer, they trying to sit there and tell a sister that they who dislike the black woman's hair is upset. You're the one who need to relax. It's not the sister here that needs to get a relaxer, a perm, and so forth and so on. And this is no disrespect intended to any audience who happens to like or dislike what I'm presenting. But perms can mess up your womb, my sister. The perms can go and seep through the pores of your head into your brain and damage your uterus. That's how bad it actually can be. All right? Now, when you find people saying that a man should cut his beard and he is presented then as quote unquote cute, the Hebrew understanding of cute, brothers and sisters, is the root word nachmad. That's the same root word that is seen in the book of Genesis when Eve partook of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and her eyes was open, but that's when she also got burnt. You understand? So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. We're supposed to partake of the tree of life, not always run after the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Syphilis is a form of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's not something you want to feel. All right? Next slide. Leviticus chapter 13, verse 29 to verse 30. And when a man or woman have a plague upon the head or upon the beard, then the priest shall look on the plague, and behold, if the appearance thereof be deeper than the skin, and there be in it yellow thin hair, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a skull. It is leprosy of the head or of the beard. So what are we pointing out, brothers and sisters, right here? It says this even within the Hebrew. What ish, O Isha, ki yih bo, naga, barosh, o bazakwan. Zakwan meaning beard. Wara'a ha-kohen, et hanega. Wahine mo'ehu, amok min ha'or, ubo se'ir zahob, dak. Watime oto ha-kohen, netek hu, za'ra'at harosh, o hazakwan hu. Let's point this out right here where the arrow is. Se'or zahob, zadeh he bet. Quamats, and then over the hay is a kolam. Zahob, brothers and sisters, is translated as yellow as well as the word blonde. So if a person has a thin yellow hair or a thin blonde hair coming up, that person is said to have the plague of leprosy. Yet you can see yellow hair, aka blonde hair, is a European delicacy once it comes down to their women. They like that. The Pamela Anderson type looking aspect, the Christina Applegate type looking aspect. You understand? Blonde beauties as they are referred to. You understand? The scriptures, the Old Testament, brothers and sisters, in Leviticus chapter 13, if you have Se'or, which means hair, Zahob, yellow hair coming out of your skin, you have what? Tima, unclean. Oto, he is unclean. HaKohen, the priest. Tima, to pronounce, to proclaim. Unclean. The priest shall pronounce him unclean. Netek hu. It is a skull. All right? So this is something we just want to point out for edification purposes. Inside of the culture of the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, having blonde hair was not a beautiful thing. It was considered part of the plague, not a good thing, not a cute thing, to use layman terms. Next slide. Daniel chapter 10, verse 5 through 6. I lifted up my eyes and behold. I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen with loins, whose loins were girded with the fine gold of Uphaz. His body also was like the beryl, and his face as the appearance of lightning, and his eyes as torches of fire, and his arms and his feet like the color to burnished brass, and the voice of his words like the voice of a multitude. Brothers and sisters, in the vision that Daniel had and what he saw what we would today consider a person who's black. The color of brass is the color of a penny. So if you were to take that, and as it says there, burnished brass, let's see how that looks. Could it look like this? This gentleman right here. Could that look like burnished brass? This here, as the Libyans, look like burnished brass. Could this look like burnished brass? See, the reason why I point out the book of Daniel chapter 10, brothers and sisters, is because when you read about the aspect of people who were called burnt, they were called, in modern terminologies, Ethiopian. Ethiops, or Ethiopian ops, means burnt face. That's what the Greeks refer to as the people in the continent of Africa. Daniel was a captive, brothers and sisters, in the land of Babylon. By the time you get to Daniel chapter 10, you get to the aspect when Persia is ruling where the Babylonians were. Let's show something, brothers and sisters, going back in this particular aspect. Remember we went over this here from Persia, Iran. This is how the Persians looked, brothers and sisters, in Shushan the palace. If you go in your own time to Daniel chapter 9 and Daniel chapter 10, you read about Shushan or Susa, the palace. Could this be burnished brass that Daniel was used to seeing among the Persians? What will make Daniel say that description of what he's talking about? Because it's not an insult. You understand? It's not to be disrespectful. This was actually an image of one that the Most High was showing Daniel, of a person of status. I'm not going back and forth with the messianic understanding and the Old Testament brothers' understanding of that. That's not the point in this particular part in Daniel chapter 10. What I'm emphasizing on, brothers and sisters, in citing this right here, simply goes to show, brothers and sisters, this one thing. We've shown Hebrews as black, Ethiopians as black, Egyptians as black, Arabs as black. And when you see one having a vision, he is envisioning people that you can sit there and say today is black. So let's go on. The Lachish matter, as we explained before. Next slide. Assyria and the Israelites. The Lachish matter, the city of Judah in the time of the 8th century BCE, pictured in Assyria on the walls of Sennacherib of Assyria. This, brothers and sisters, is not ancient Sumerians, like some may have tried to say. This is a picture of ancient Israelites. Note the beard that you see from one's face. That was an Asiatic trait in most cases, with what we consider today as cornrows. These people, brothers and sisters, were not Caucasoid. The tribe of Judah was not depicted as the European Jew. This is something we want to point out, brothers and sisters. This is not something racist. This is something we're showing and citing the sources, and you can actually fact check this information. Next slide, please. Let's go on. Aramean, also known as Syrian. This is how they were depicted in ancient Egypt. All right, in the era of the New Kingdom of Egypt. Same aspect here, New Kingdom of Egypt. Brothers and sisters, as it says here, scene of Asiatic tribute bearers, tomb of Sobek-hotep of Dynasty 18. So when you're looking at this here in Dynasty 18 in the New Kingdom of Egypt, you see what? Asiatic tribute bearers. But as we can sit there and know, these people were also referred to specifically in many cases as the people of Aram, called the core inside of ancient Egypt. The ancient people of Syria, brothers and sisters, the ancient Syrians did not look like the pale, stringy hair people you see today. They look like bald men with beards that is considered in today's terminology. If you saw someone looking like this, you would say that's a black man. If you saw someone looking like this, you would say that's a black man. Not trying to be disrespectful, kind of resemble the rapper and spokesperson Common from Chicago. That's the way I view him, as that's what I see in that. Not trying to be funny or nothing like that. But let's go on. Rogers, meaning J.A. Rogers. Windsor, meaning Rudolph Windsor. Ezekiel, meaning Ezekiel, the son of Buzi in the Bible. The Chaldeans were originally Negroes. J.A. Rogers, in his book called 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro with Complete Proof, cited another person by the name of Higgins, who wrote a book called Anacalypsis, in which he stated the Chaldeans were originally Negroes. How does that become important? Because we're showing pictures and reference purposes for edification reasoning. Went too far. This is what I wanted to show. All right. Chaldea is in the vicinity where the arrow is on the map. All right. Like the Gulf of Aqaba that you see right here. This is where Chaldea would be. This is Asiatic, brothers and sisters. This is why you find, not to jump the gun, the Kingdom of Sheba in Ethiopia and the Kingdom of Sheba in Saudi Arabia. This is why you find people that came from the era of Yemen and Oman going into Ethiopia and back and forth. So this is not too hard for edification purposes. You cannot let the European try to sit there and say, okay, sub-Saharan Africa means it was black. No. Why do we go there and say such is not the case, as they're only trying to point out sub-Saharan Africa? Because Libya is north of the Sahara. Yet we begin to see this is how the ancient people of Libya looked. Don't try to picture ancient Africa as the aspect after the Ptolemies and the Seleucids had their way. All right? So let's go on, brothers and sisters, for edification purposes. Pictured in Assyria on, okay. Next slide. The Babylonians were Negroes, the origin of the Negro race. According to Rudolf Windsor, in his book Babylon and Timbuktu, he stated the Babylonians were Negroes, the origin of the Negro race. Why do you think, even if you watch that movie with the vampires that was in it, Blade, they wanted to go to where Iraq was because they said that's where the people would have been comfortable because that's what they call the cradle of civilization. And what were they trying to do there? Annihilate what was originally there. So this is something we want to point out, brothers and sisters, for edification purposes. And in the movie Blade, it was a black man, played by Wesley Snipes, that had to go and sit there and eradicate the other people who want to sit there and devastate and hide and conceal the aspect of the true people that would have been and what they consider in history as the cradle of civilization. So these are the kinds of things we want to point out for edification purposes. Let's go on. Ezekiel, this is going to Ezekiel chapter 23. Girded with girdles upon their loins, with pendant turbans upon their heads, all of them captains to look upon, the likeness of the sons of Babylon, even of Chaldea, the land of their nativity. Ezekiel chapter 23 speaks about, brothers and sisters, the Israelites, northern and southern kingdom. You understand? It says their origin, the land where they were native to, is the land of Babylon. So let's go back, taking what the Bible in Ezekiel chapter 23 says. Let's go back and see how the ancient Babylonians in part were depicted. So this is why we want to point this out for edification purposes. You see this right here? The Babylonians. And you can even get this book. This is how, with the beard, all right, it's being pictured. The man, in layman terms, is a black man. Swarthy, dark brown. So this is something we want to point out. So if that's the true image of the ancient Babylonians, why? With the Bible, in the book of Ezekiel, as we see here, it says, girded with girdles upon their loins, with pendant turbans upon their heads, all of them captains to look upon, the likeness, meaning the image of the sons of Babylon, even of Chaldea. Because Babylon, Chaldea was adjacent to each other. We already point out that we're citing scholars that said the Chaldeans were originally Negroes. Negroes, brothers and sisters, from the Portuguese and Spanish word negro, which means negra, which means black. You understand? So this is something we want to point out. Stop trying to separate the Western Asiatic man and the African man once it comes down to color. Because the ancient nations who were depicting themselves looking similar in complexions, they didn't see themselves different in complexions. They saw themselves as different according to language, culture, and geography. This is what we want to point out as being a son of Israel. If you are teaching history about a people and you don't deal with the language, with the culture, and the geography of a people, you have missed the boat. This is why I went over the maps, because it shows you the geography that we're talking about, brothers and sisters. Next slide. Let's go on. Babylon and Chaldea. So you can begin to see where Chaldea was. It should be noted that secular and biblical history speaks of Babylon started by the Ethiopians. There were also two Ethiopias. the Indus Kush by modern India, and the Kush in continental Africa, or were of black people. So this is something, brothers and sisters, showing for edification purposes, giving honor and praise to the Creator, showing the map, showing the references, what we're talking about. See, Chaldea and Babylon in the same vicinity. Persia, called Iran of today. Media, where the Medes were. All right? We've shown the picture of the ancient Persians already. Arabia, we already went over Muller in his book when he cited the Romans saying that the Arabs were swarthy or dark or black. All right? So in the New Babylonian Empire, we see the Israelites all around there as being taken over. This is what we want to point out for edification purposes, brothers and sisters. Let's go on, if you will, to the next slide. Kingdoms and empires in Western Asia and Europe. Babylon, after defeating the Assyrians in the 7th century BCE, Babylon came to power in 606 to 538 BCE. Persia, after defeating Babylon in 538 BCE, came to power to 331 BCE. Greece, after defeating Darius III in 331 BCE, came to power until 168 BCE in the Pydna battle and the Battle of Corinth in 146 BCE. Rome came to power in 146 BCE. Then in 285 AD or CE, okay, separated to east and west. The west fell in 476 AD. All right, I want to state 476 AD, not BCE. That was a typo. I admit my error. So this is something, brothers and sisters, we want to point out for edification purposes. All right, so Rome came to power, as we discussed here. When you had the situation with Diocletian and Maximilian in the 3rd century AD or the 3rd century CE, it split. Then in the 5th century AD, sorry, this is not meant to be BCE. All right, as you see here, that's a typo, I must admit. All right, that's when the Western Roman Empire fell. The Eastern Roman Empire fell, which was known as the Byzantine Empire in 1453 AD or 1453 CE. All right, so this is something we want to point out for edification purposes, brothers and sisters. So kingdoms and empires in Western Asia and Europe. So how did it get from predominantly shown as black, black, black to white? Greece was, brothers and sisters, we're speaking about Greece after the Peloponnesian War, all right? European modern day looking. Let's go on to the next slide. But let's remember, Rome came to power after Greece. Strabo and Durant. Strabo in 63 BCE to 24 AD or CE stated that the Hebrews in Cyrene, Libya, are in all cities. And it is hard to find from Egypt and Libya where the Hebrews were, and they have influenced others into their way of living. So they had what you refer to as converts, all right? Proselytes, due to proselytizing. Ancient Israel was known for that. Strabo was a historian and a geographer. Will Durant, another historian, who wrote his book, Caesar in Christ, published in 1944, says, Will Durant stated that by 70 AD, there were thousands of Jews, blacks by the way, in Seleucia, Tigris, and numerous in Arabia, and crossed into Ethiopia. Arabia, as we see, is here. Ethiopia is here. So from Arabia, they had no problem going into Ethiopia. So when you may want to look up the book Babylon and Timbuktu by Rudolf Windsor, in which he speaks about the Israelites in a place called Yathrib. All right, Yathrib. You may want to look that up in history. All right, next slide. Afro-Asiatic language, as well as Amharic being on that list. Let's look at this because we went over this before. All right, Afro-Asiatic, descending from Ethiopian language, you get the Egyptian. Near East, Semitic. New Africa. Wonder why they named it that. But let's go on in this particular aspect. Semitic, Akkadian, Hebrew, Aramaic. Going on down. Ge'ez, Tigray, Harari. And then we see here Amharic. Why did I mention Amharic as important? Because we're going to show, brothers and sisters, that a speech called Amharic, which is spoken today, even in current modern day Ethiopia, is connected linguistically, brothers and sisters, on the same family tree as Hebrew. Let's see how they look. This is a person that is modern Amharic. Brothers and sisters, this person, in layman terms, is black. Not too hard to figure that out. So Amharic, you can look that up. And let's see. The language that particular person speaks, Amharic, is connected in linguistics to Hebrew and Aramaic. Aram. Where did we see Aram before? Aram, Syrian. How they looked right here in this picture. How they look right here. By the way, Syria is the Greek terminology for Aram. Aram is the Hebrew word, and in Greek, they will say it as Syria. So let's understand that Aramean is not Armenian. All right? So this is something we want to point out. All right? The people of Aram and the people of Armenia is not saying one and the same thing. So let's go on, brothers and sisters, in this particular regard, continuing on. This language here is connected. Akkadian, the parent, according to this chart here, to Hebrew and Aramaic. Akkadian, brothers and sisters, is the people of Akkad. Akkad was a kingdom and people that was started by Nimrod, and Nimrod was a descendant of Cush, and Cush is aka Ethiopia. So it's not too hard to figure out why you see this right here starting off as Ethiopia. You understand? This is something we want to point out for edification purposes. Brothers and sisters, we see, brothers and sisters, the people, how they look, who speak the language that is on the same family tree as Hebrew. Next slide. Beta Israel, quote unquote, Falasha. This, brothers and sisters, is the so-called Falashas, their children, in Ethiopia. Like you see the mountains behind them and so forth and so on. All right? Girl, skirt, girl, skirt, female, skirt, female, skirt, female, skirt, female, skirt, female, skirt, male, no skirt. Brothers and sisters, the Beta Israel, the women in their own understanding, even their daughters, were not women saying, like some Israelite sisters try to argue today, a woman can wear pants. Well, why then do you find the oldest community prior to the time of the Talmudic teaching in their own place, though they stated they descend from Jerusalem and the land of Israel, but they've been in Ethiopia for over 2,000 years? Brothers and sisters, why do you not see their females depicted like you see some of the Israelite sisters when they're depicting themselves today? This is no disrespect and shot at sisters. This is something we want to point out. The people who you see here, such as that beautiful person there, speaking the language connected to the Hebrew, the garments that they wore would not have been that much different. Why do we point out with the garments in this particular regard? Is this. Let's look. You see this right here, Libyan, and how they looked with wraps on their head, turbans on their head wraps. Let's see what it says in Ezekiel. Right? Girded with girdles upon their loins. They was not about letting their loins being shown like ancient Egypt. Let's go on. With pendant turbans upon their heads. So wearing the turban was not an Arab modern Arab thing. It was an ancient custom done by different people throughout parts of Africa and Western Asia. All right. So this is what we want to point out for edification purposes. All right. The Jews of Ethiopia and Portuguese. In 1670, the Portuguese reported that in Ethiopia slash Abyssinia, there is a group of people who keep the Old Testament ways. They apparently was an embarrassment of the European Jews. This ties in later. The so-called Falashas, believe it or not, is the people that the renowned scholar Dr. Ben said that he came from. Dr. Ben, who did not preferably like the Bible, came from a community in Gondar, Ethiopia, that laid claim to be in the house of Israel. Is that why perhaps Dr. Ben kept the Hebrew name Yosef ben Yochanan? I don't know why he did that, being that he always claimed Kemet and Ramses and the ancient Egyptians and so forth. But he would tell you, may he rest in peace now, he would have told you, as stated in videos, that the Falashas, that's his people. This is how Dr. Ben's people look. They call themselves Beta Yisrael. But you know what the difference is? Like we pointed out before on this particular channel, with the guy, Adisu Musala, who stated inside of a teaching that I did on this particular channel with the video that was called From Averis to Alabama, or From Africa to America, or From Egypt to Alabama, on the same particular channel, Adisu Musala stated that the transport during what they call Operation Moses and later on Operation Solomon was a hoax. The European Jews did not treat the so-called philosophers correctly. They did not keep the end of the bargain. The European Jew did what their ancestors did to the natives. You made a treaty and you broke it. Not too hard to figure out. Same customs being passed down. Same kind of garments being passed down. Same kind of customs, breaking treaties and not being obliged by it. You understand? The ancient Maccabees made a treaty with the Romans. The Romans did not really uphold their end of the deal in that particular regard. You understand? So this is just something we want to point out for edification purposes. Let's go on, brothers and sisters, if we will. And I want to emphasize on this. You see this person who speaks Amharic in that particular head wrap or head scarf or head covering that you see there? And then you see this one right here? That's part of the modest apparel, brothers and sisters. There's no way that a man, and I don't mean to sound carnal, but there's no way that as a man, you're going to see a female, all right, dressed like that, as you see here, as you see here. Now, of course, these are children, so of course, ain't no grown man supposed to be wanting no child in that particular aspect. But the point I'm making is this, brothers and sisters, is that when you see, and we're going to say a grown woman, all right, dressed like this in those garments, you know as a man, you just can't, excuse me, run up in that. You know when you see a sister in her garments and you don't see the crack of her behind and you don't sit there and see the imprint of her shape, you know as a man, if you want to be a dog, that's going to be a hard woman to sit there and catch. That's going to be a hard woman to sit there and win over. Try to talk to a woman coming out of a community such as that right there, such as we see in this particular picture right here, and try to sit there and win them over with game that people win Western women over in the United States. And I don't say this in no disrespect because I'm from Brooklyn. I'm from New York. My mother's from Brooklyn. My father is from Queens. My grandparents are from New York. And my great-grandparents come out of North Carolina, Virginia, and Texas. So-called Black American. So when I say Western, I do not mean any disrespect whatsoever. I'm just saying that the way of the culture that our people have picked up in the West is very over-sexualized to where the garments show a certain way. Oh, it's hot, so I must sit there and wear pom-pom shorts. It is hot in Ethiopia where these people are in the picture. One theory teaches that Africa comes from a Greek word meaning hot. Perhaps that is the case. I don't teach that. But if that is the case, it might serve to reason because Africa does have heat, yet you don't see they of many particular cultures walking around with their crack showing, with the aspect of the cleavage showing. When women doing that, they're doing that to get a certain type of attention, but you're going to get the negative attention. All attention, my sister, is not good. Every dollar, my brother, is not good. You understand? And every view on YouTube is not good. So if you're going like a whore online for views, every view is not good. I don't know if my channel is being watched by those who try to sit there and set somebody up, but giving thanks and praise to the Most High, as long as a brother has internet use and able to sit there and present these kind of messages, so be it. The Most High protect me and us, Yah willing. You understand? Getting back, brothers and sisters, into this particular aspect. You know, as a man, speaking as a man myself, and when you see a woman in her garments, you know good and well you are not, quote unquote, going to be able to tap that easily. That's not happening. You know you have to come culturally. And coming culturally is not sitting up there sending penis pics. So this shows you the house of Israel and even how they have the children looking. So when you can see, brothers and sisters, that the Most High said about the priests of Israel, that they are not supposed to go up by steps so that their nakedness be not seen. So when you can sit there and go and know and understand in the culture of Israel, that the woman dressed a certain way, as you see in the book of Isaiah chapter 3, as well as Ezekiel chapter 16, where it says, I put a ring within your nose. Nose rings was not uncommon in ancient days. European culture does not teach to have nose rings. I'm not talking about that Gothic thing. I'm talking about how the cultures line up all the way through, brothers and sisters. So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. When you see your sister in her attire, as a man, you know you're going to have to pay her more respect than the ones who's showing their cleavage. They're the ones who's sitting up there and you able to see the imprint of her nipples. They're the ones who sit up there and you able to see a little bit of the crack of her behind when she perhaps deliberately just bends over and show. But then when a man gets into that kind of thought, why you want to disrespect me like that? Would you want somebody to talk to your mother like that? I will hope and pray my mother ain't looking like you, because mommy is mommy. Jump off is jump off. We're going to keep it 100. When a man sees a woman dressed in Western attire, such as the nudity things that is shown, is straight up lasciviousness. And we can see why the clinics are so rampage with people to where they're saying giving out free condoms in high school. Brothers and sisters, we have to step up our pedigree within ourselves. We have to step up, brothers and sisters, how we deal one with another, how we treat one another. There's nothing wrong, brothers and sisters, to apologize to your brother if you offended him or her. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a sign that something was shown to you. Nothing, brothers and sisters, is wrong with saying, I need mitzvah. Pardon me, correct me if I'm wrong in saying it in Hebrew. I'm sorry. I stand corrected. Asiti Shagaga. I made an error. Salakli Aki. Forgive me, my brother. There's nothing wrong with that. When you go in the book of Ecclesiasticus, in the Apocrypha, the 28th chapter, how does a man appear before the Most High without asking his brother for forgiveness. You understand? We have a culture, O house of Israel, that we must sit there and achieve, and it can be done. Next slide. The Jews of Ethiopia and the Portuguese. All right, they apparently is or was an embarrassment to the European Jews. This ties in later. Let's go on. Next slide. Queen Kahina, a black woman who lived in the 7th century AD, who ruled over the Berbers and is said to lead a war against the Arabs in taking. She is said to be of the Jews of North Africa. So this dates as stated to the 7th century CE or AD. You may want to look her up to fact check that. Next slide. Carthage matter. In the 9th century BCE, the people from Tyre went from there to settle in what is now Tunisia. In the 4th century BCE, it is said they, according to the Hanno and Periplus, went from Carthage to Gambia. All right. So here's Carthage in Tunisia, right over here in this particular part. And so in the 4th century, after being there for about 500 years or so, it is said they migrated to Gambia. Gambia is over here. 9th century BCE, people from Tyre. Let's scroll back up. For edification purposes, brothers and sisters, so we can begin to see what we're talking about for reasoning purposes. All right. Must have skipped the map. But here we go. Tyre is over here, and this was pointed out on this channel before. This is the area where Tyre is at. All right? May not say verbally or written that is, but this is the area. You can look that up on your own time too. So according to what we just saw, it says this, brothers and sisters, what? In the 9th century BCE, the people from Tyre went from there, from Tyre, right, to settle in what is now Tunisia. Tunisia, where Carthage was in Tunisia. In the 4th century BCE, that is the difference of 500 years, it is said they went from Carthage to Gambia. Now, you may want to look up the Periplus of Hanno, according to Hanno and Periplus. All right? Went from Carthage to the Gambia. Gambia is over here. So you see they went from Tyre, which is not shown, but it's over here, to Tunisia, from Tunisia to Gambia. See the migration of people going west? Let's go on, brothers and sisters, to the next part. Gambia to Virginia by West Indies. Reynolds, in his book, Stand the Storm, which is a book you can get online, stated that the distance from Gambia to the West Indies is 3,200 miles. Cowley, in his book, Black Cargoes, stated that Basel Negroes were brought from the West Indies to Virginia. So let's look, brothers, sisters, right here. Gambia, right here, Western Africa. Gambia, right here, Western Africa. West Indies, over here. So I want to point this out. When you read Basel Negroes, Basel is in regard, the Basel Negroes were the black people that was captured by the people of Spain or the Spaniards. All right. So that's something we want to point out in that particular regard. So let's look. All right. They went from Tyre, which is over here, to Tunisia, from Tunisia to the Gambia, from the Gambia to the West Indies, from the West Indies to Virginia, from Tyre to Carthage in Tunisia, to the Gambia, to the West Indies, to Virginia. Do you see what we're going at, O house of Israel? That is evidence purposes of how the children of Israel scattered. So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. Next slide. Ghana Empire, shown right here. Next slide. Mali Empire, shown right here. Next slide. Songhai Empire, shown right here. Why do I want to stop here? Timbuktu Remember that book by Rudolph Windsor called Babylon and Timbuktu? Let's remember where Timbuktu is in Western Africa. All right? In Mali. And remember, from Babylon to Timbuktu, according to the author there. But let's see where Babylon was on the map. Right here is where Babylon was on the map, by Chaldea. This is where Babylon was. So from Babylon, going all the way across the Mediterranean, going all the way through Africa, all right? We see, according to that, Timbuktu. You may want to get that book to get the information I'm expounding on. Next slide. Tonghoi Empire. Slave trade aspect. Davidson. The Spanish. They could not get enough Spaniard slaves. Where were they to look? The answer was West Africa. Already the Portuguese and Spanish had imported a few West African captives into their own countries. Cantor, in his book, stated the following. One of Henry, meaning Henry the Navigator, one of Henry's navigators, Anton Goncalves, reached the Guinea coast in 1441 and returned with slaves. In 1445 to 1455, the discoveries brought massive slaves to Portugal. Let's go on to the next slide. Slave trade aspect. Blacks brought to Cuba in 1506. In 1516, Charles II issued licenses in regards to having blacks as slaves. The Asiento from 1543 to 1834 is what was used to have blacks brought to the West Indies as slaves. The Portuguese in the 17th century had the Chachejo or Chacheo slaving company, Cacheo slaving company. The Dutch had the Dutch West India Company. In the 1630s, it was common for Dutch to take over Portuguese ships. Brothers and sisters, this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. Now, I deliberately, in this particular slide, did not mention anything about North America. Remember when we was going over the aspect, or should I say the United States of today, right? Remember we was going over before about them who tried to say that the Atlantic slave trade didn't happen and we were already here, even though we saw black people all over the earth. So we, if you just want to put the colloquialism as black, you cannot say black was just right here originally because you had blacks in Europe. Okay, this has been pointed out by our brothers, the Moors, for edification purposes. So getting into this particular part right here, brothers and sisters, you had them brought to Cuba, Charles II, that's Spain. Asiento, that's Spain. Portuguese, that's Portugal and Brazil. The Dutch, fighting over the territories in Brazil against the Portuguese. Tell those people in Brazil the slave trade didn't happen. When they still have memories that would have been passed down from their great-great-great-grandparents about what happened. Because remember, in Brazil, where the majority of the slave ships went to, Brazil ended slavery in 1888. This is now the year 2018 for edification purposes. So from 1888 to 1988, the 100 years, Brazil just ended slavery 130 years ago. There have people who are to this day over the age of 100. Maybe not 130, but there are people that are 102, 103. So if they were perhaps in the land of Brazil, would not their parents or grandparents been part of those enslaved in Brazil in the 1870s or in the 1860s? Tell them the slave trade did not go west and see what they'll tell you. Let's go on to the next slide. The slave trade aspect, part 2. Ponce de Leon, who tried his best to obliterate the Taino people in modern-day Puerto Rico, is also the same who, quote, discovered Florida in 1513. In 1565, blacks were enslaved by the Spanish in what is now Florida until the era of 1810, then continued to 1865. Vasquez Ayllón, working for Charles V of Spain, had blacks brought as slaves to what is now South Carolina, some say North Carolina, in 1526. John Hawkins, from 1562 to 1567, did 3 voyages in which blacks were sold as slaves in Colombia and Venezuela. John Hawkins used for his legal status the asiento. All right, but John Hawkins worked for the Queen of England. So the Queen of England family, brothers and sisters, even to this day, goes back to those who were involved in the slave trade. Tell the English Parliament and what they was involved in, and in Liverpool where they was building the slave ships. Tell them that they wasn't guilty of the slave trade. Tell the people in Brazil that they are not descendants of those who were victims of the slave trade. That story of the slave trade never happening or coming over here to the West as a myth only works with people inside the United States. Correct me if I'm wrong. Because in Haiti and in Jamaica, they have celebrations for being free. In Haiti in 1803 or 1804, and in Jamaica in 1838. Then tell them people that history did not happen. That only works here inside of what they like to call, in certain cases, Turtle Island in North America, the so-called United States in particular, where the black man is said to be 13% and sit there and contributes less than 5% of the economy. You can tell those people anything, and they'll sit there and go and believe it. This is something we want to point out for edification purposes. Brothers and sisters, let's go on to the next slide. A lie. The first slave owner in America was not only a black man, he went to court and demanded it. Now, I went over this several times, but I want to keep on going over it. I went over it in my book, Egypt Talk and Writing, and I went over it in my book called Deuteronomy 28. Because this lie got to stop. Brothers and sisters, Anthony Johnson was not the pioneer of American slavery. And I go so far to say that if we're talking in the 1650s, who painted this picture? And were they dressing even as such in that time? They swear black people don't read and study. This is why I cannot, and it's not about me, but this is why, speaking for myself, I cannot befriend white people, because you hope I don't know something. You hope I stay blind to something. You want to keep me ignorant of certain things. You can't be my friend and hope I stay ignorant of certain things. That's not a friend. It's a foe. I personally do not particularly care to study like physics and chemistry and biology and so forth like that. But I'm not going to sit there and try to tell somebody that they shouldn't study it. Or if I see somebody has a passion in something and it's not hurting nobody, I'm not going to tell that person you shouldn't do that and slow down and so forth and so on. Because the house of Israel, we can't slow down. We already behind. We got to play catch up and do catch up. We can't be the tomato that got squished talking about catch up. You understand? We got to sit there and keep these types of things going. Whatever talent you got, brothers and sisters, bring it out. You understand? So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes. Brothers and sisters, this is not Anthony Johnson in the meme. This is a person that was called Hayden. Lewis Hayden, not Anthony Johnson. They done lied yet again. Next slide. Hugh Thomas matter. In 1625, the Dutch man, Johan de Willem, received a license to operate in the West Indies, Brazil, Virginia, and Guinea. In 1626, the French traded in slaves and other stuff, such as ivory and gum. In 1619, We see about the Dutch man of war bringing 20 blacks as slaves to Jamestown, Virginia. This was not the first time blacks were enslaved in what is now the United States. New York matter. And what is now New York? From 1626 to 1664, the date it became a colony. The Dutch had blacks as slaves. From 1664 to 1776, the British began to enslave blacks in New York. From 1776 to 1827, Americans began to enslave blacks in New York. New York became a state in 1788. So our people in the north, the north, the north, all right, New York were enslaved, going all the way back in recorded history to the 1600s. If the European man is writing documentations about them as the enslaver, I'm not going to sit there and deny that. And I want to give due respect to a friend and a brother of mine who made a salient point to me. The brother's name is Zebulon Hedekiah ben Lewi. He said the monuments celebrating the aspect of the Confederacy should not be torn down. Leave the monuments about the Confederacy in the South up so it can be a sign and people can see this is the people that stood against your ancestors. Don't try to hide it by tearing down the monument. No, let that Confederate flag stay up so everybody can see from generation to generation what the people did. You understand? It might hurt, but leave that there so the understanding can never be forgotten on why there's a conflict between the peoples within the United States. Next slide. There were 12 presidents who had slaves: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, Murray, Harrison, Tyler, Polk, Taylor, Johnson, and Grant. Lincoln's wife had slaves also. Lincoln fired 2 people for freeing the slaves. You understand? A guy named McClellan and a guy named Fremont. Lincoln fired them for freeing black people. You can check this out in J.A. Rogers' book, 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro. You understand? When Lincoln was elected, they sent a letter to him in 1860 and said, excuse me, end quote, you ain't nothing but a goddamn nigga. Lincoln was not what you call black of today. He was not a black man. Every depiction made of Abraham Lincoln as a black man, which has been in news articles in the 1800s, was just to tease him and make fun of him. This is Lincoln as black because he must have wanted to fight for black people. This is why we have to gain understanding and when we're studying. Next slide. A style of literate slaves. Gabriel Prosser. It appears from the scanty information available that the Bible was used to impress the Negroes, that they, as the Israelites, could throw off the yoke of slavery and that God would come to their aid. Turner was a mystic who had found in reading the Bible what he regarded as a solution to the problem of Negro slavery. 55 whites were killed, Negro in the United States, by Frazier, a book you can get online. Both quotes come from that book called Negro in the United States. Next slide. Oluda Equiano. He stressed the similarities between the Old Testament Jews and those of his own people, the Igbo. Like the Israelites in their primitive state, our government, our chiefs, our judges, our wise men, elders, we had our circumcision, sacrifices, washings, and purifications, and on the same occasions as they did. Remember, we spoke earlier about the customs that passed down from people to people. Oluda Equiano compared his ways of his people as the Igbo to the ways of the Old Testament Jews. That is to say, the Israelites of the Old Testament. Do you see why some of us stay Old Testament based? That's not the main subject of this presentation, however. But this is just something we want to point out for edification purposes. Life of Oluda Equiano, page 20. Next slide. The Europeans in the wrong places. The picture you see here on the left is Johannesburg in South Africa. The picture that you see here is Jerusalem, or the said Jerusalem, because what the media presents as Jerusalem is really in the land of Ephraim. And what they try to call or refer to as Arad is more so the correct Jerusalem. But that's not the main point about that, because both the real Jerusalem, which is like a desert, and the said Jerusalem in the media is both within the borders of the land of ancient Israel, both lands, all right? But the point I want to emphasize right here, it says Europeans in the wrong places. You're in the wrong place over here in Africa. You don't belong there. It's not your habitat, not your climate. You understand? And over here, and I don't mean to sound harsh or disrespectful, skin cancer is very high among the Jewish people in the land of Israel because their bodies are not made for that kind of heat. You belong in Europe. You are a European. See, you're a European. Ashkenazi. Ashkenaz is a son of Japhet. Japhet is part of the people that the book of Josephus says went over and stayed from the land of Cadiz, Cadiz, which is Spain, all the way to the mountains of going toward Asia. All right? But in the land of Israel, which was formerly the land of Canaan, we showed you pictures of how ancient Israelites looked. We showed a picture of how the ancient Canaanites looked and resembled. These people you see here, and even the modern Jerusalem, do not look like the pictures we showed. They're trying to hide that history. So be you in Jerusalem as stated, or in Johannesburg, you're in the wrong place, European. Go back to Europe where you come from. No love. Lacking. That's love. Go back to Europe. Go there. That's your home. How you want to be upset if somebody want to tell you to go home? You should go home. Go home. Next slide. Middle East. The term Middle East is made up in 1902. There is no such thing as the Middle Eastern race, since there is no set land called Middle East or language called Middle East. The terminology Middle East was created by a guy named General Mahan, all right, in the year 1902, in the 20th century, all right? But there is no language called Middle East, and therefore there can be no people called Middle East, all right? So this is something we want to point out for edification purposes, brothers and sisters, all right? Bibliography. I do this to show the edification purposes. I wanted to upgrade and didn't just want to just make a PowerPoint, show some pictures, state my name, advertise my book, say shalom, and then not at least give a bibliography. One of the brothers I know, I'm not going to mention his name, but an Israelite brother, very cool friend of mine online, you know, he said YouTube doesn't cite no sources in bibliography. Well, on my channel, I would like to start doing so. Okay, bibliography, Black Summa by Hermel Herrnstein. Before the Mayflower by LaRon Bennett Jr. History of Ancient Israel by Michael Grant. Biblical Archaeology in Focus by Chauville. The Babylonians by Gwendolyn Leak. Bible as History in Pictures by Warner Keller. African Presence in Early Europe by Ivan Sertima. Ancient Near East in Text and Pictures by James Pritchard. Bibliography continued. Atlas of Ancient Egypt, Baines and Malek. The Encyclopedia of Medieval Ages by Norman Cantor. A History of West Africa by Basil Davidson. The Slave Trade by Hugh Thomas. The Negro in the United States by E. Franklin Fraser. Giving honor and praise unto the Most High. Shalom.